precipitation wise, we're well above average for this period of time. Again, telling nothing that you don't already know if you haven't been watching the news. With folks, relatives up north have once again seen the Russian River come to the doorstep, which you haven't seen in a long time. The one thing I will say about the precipitation, and again, the percentages are good and are helpful to see, but it's that two things. It's the consistency, right? We get it over time, and the frequency, right? So we like to see the percentages go up, but we like to see that occur over a longer window, right? These big storms that come in and just blow through, while it makes all these numbers go crazy and it looks like the world's going the right way, a lot of that runs off to the ocean and escapes us. So when you get to talking about Temecula Valley, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, we're like to see the numbers. We like to see the storms. These patterns have been relatively good for us, at least in Southern California. We've had rain and intermittent periods of dry, and then heavy rain, and then again intermittent dry, which is good because that's what we need to allow that water to saturate down into our groundwater basin and actually replenish it. So again, the numbers are really great. We're well above normal, but keep that in mind that these storms, if they're just blowing through and blowing back to the ocean, it really doesn't solve our issue here locally. I know it's a hard message to sell the public that we're not out of the drought, but we're not out of the drought. If you look at the slide here, we're better positioned than we were last year, right? The state isn't completely in that darker orange, and you're starting to see some bright spots. But again, we're going to need to see more conditions like what we've just got this last month. So again, starting off from the water year, it looked pretty dismal. We got into December, it started to get a little weather. January started getting better. And so far up to this point, the state has, migrated from that dark red to a more positive position. So let's talk about our other source of supply, and that's that Colorado River Basin. And that's been a basin that's really been stressed. And obviously, as we all know, the input from that area is constrained. So again, from last year, you can see pretty much the whole upper basin and lower basin was heavily in drought. A little better position right now, at least in the south part of the basin. Arizona and New Mexico, that feeder is a little better. Colorado looks good also, which is very important. Again, that's that snow melt that's going to come off the Rockies and feed that Colorado system. But again, one of the major players, Utah, is still experiencing, a severe drought area. So again, if we can continue the trend, it'll be good. This is definitely not going to solve the issue. And we'll talk about that when we get to the later part of the presentation. The most important thing for this rainfall, and we'll take a look at it, is where it's fallen, how fast it's fallen, and how much of that gets captured either within the lake, Vail Lake, or within the groundwater basin. And as we talked last year, most of our storms ring out on the west side of the district. And as we get to the east, they become less and less dominant or predominant. This is the totals for this year's water year. So again, this isn't just from the last storm. This is actually going back to October, the start of the water year. And what's really key to see here is that while we're ringing out those storms, we're still getting a good amount of rain out on the east side. 8 inches out at Vail so far, 8 3/4 at the VDC, which is where most of the recharging within that basin. Even down in the middle part of the basin at 141 and 120, we're seeing a good amount of rain. And why is that important? Again, like we talked last year, 66% of our production is within that Paba Valley, and 57% of it is from Anza out to the VDC. So it's really important that we see that those storms and those weather events stay out onto the east, or at least make it out to the east. All good news, exciting, right? Let's get to be the guy with Barry, that there's water falling from the sky finally. But I also come with caution. And we've played this out probably since 2010. I've used this slide in previous presentations when we spoke to you. And it really speaks to the point that, a couple of big years, if they're not followed up with above average weather, what happens is you fall back into the same trend. So the recovery needs to be more than 1 year. I know that it's hard sometimes to speak to the public about that, good winter doesn't solve everything, especially when we talk about groundwater basins. Especially when we talk about basins that have been, heavily leaned and dependent upon over the last 5 to 7 years. It's going to take time for us to see those recoveries, and we're going to need more weather conditions like we've seen in the last couple of months to continue, not just through this year, but again, hopefully through next year.